Quiero dar la bienvenida entonces a Wendy Behary y hacer un resumen de su larga trayectoria profesional. Wendy es la directora del Centro de Terapia de Esquemas de Nueva York y Nueva Jersey. Es la principal colaboradora del Dr. Jeffrey Young, creador de terapia de esquemas desde fines de los años 80. Wendy es la expresidenta y exdirectora de Training de la Sociedad Internacional de Terapia de Esquemas. Es una de las fundadoras y consultoras de la Academia de Terapia Cognitiva del Dr. Aaron Beck. Es autora de numerosos papers y capítulos de libros sobre terapia de esquemas y terapia cognitiva. Su área de interés y expertise es psicoterapia con pacientes narcisistas, así como también el ayudar a personas que interactúan con ellos, ellas, y se ven afectadas por su personalidad. En su práctica clínica se dedica entonces a terapia individual con pacientes narcisistas, a coordinar grupos de apoyo a personas que viven con ellos o ellas y a hacer también terapia de pareja. Wendy es autora del excelente libro Desarmando al Narcisista, libro que felizmente está traducido al español y que se los recomiendo. Utilizaremos hoy la misma modalidad que en la conferencia de la doctora Farrell. Wendy hará una presentación sobre narcisismo y luego ustedes tendrán la posibilidad de hacer preguntas por aproximadamente 30 minutos. Les agradecemos que solo hagan sus preguntas en mi chat privado. Y haremos lo posible para que Wendy conteste la mayor parte de sus preguntas. Les recordamos, por favor, que mantengan los micrófonos silenciados y las cámaras prendidas durante toda la conferencia. Sin más, los dejo ahora con Wendy Behary. Espero que disfruten mucho de la presentación y nos vemos en un rato para la sesión de preguntas. Gracias.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? I'm Wendy Behary. Thank you, Patricia, so much for that lovely introduction. And Patricia, I so appreciate your passion and enthusiasm for schema therapy. It's really a beautiful thing as you share with me this great love of this model, which has brought so much amazing results to people who suffer in so many ways, and particularly those who are suffering with these very challenging personality disorders. So let me share, I have 65 minutes to present 12 hours of material. So this is the challenge. I will try to cover the very fundamental elements of schema therapy for narcissism. I know some of you are new to schema therapy, so I want to get you excited and enthusiastic about this model as we talk about narcissism. I'll start by saying this. If you're wondering what's wrong with Wendy Behary that she would choose to specialize in working with narcissists, I like to tell a little joke, and that is they never call you. And truth is, they'll call you once they start to connect with you. And that's when you know that the work that you're doing is actually having an effect. And the real truth is, I started specializing in narcissism not by choice, but based on something that became very clear to me in the early days of my work with them. And that was noticing how triggered I would become when there was someone in the room who had these traits, who had these features in their personality. And I was curious, and I was really bothered by the fact that I could find myself feeling like I was a vulnerable child again, that I was giving in, that I was apologizing, that I was ignoring their criticisms, that I was just avoiding, basically. I could feel myself as if I had lost my professional expertise, my adult mind. And it was through that experience that, with the help of course, my great mentor and friend, Dr. Jeffrey Young, we started working on an approach in the schema therapy model for dealing with patients with narcissistic personality disorder, just as we had done with BPD. And so I'm going to share with you some of the work that we've been doing over time, the work that I've refined myself over time with certain interventions, elaborating them for the sake of this particular population, which is incredibly hard to work with, as I'm sure many of you know, which is probably why there are so many people attending. This is one of the toughest populations to treat, and that is because they trigger us like no one else. They are the most schema activating for us. And so my presentation, let me get my PowerPoint up here for you. And so my presentation will focus on a little bit on not just the idea that narcissists, of course, have schemas and they have coping modes. They have ways of being that can trigger the people around them, that can literally push people away or can bring people closer because they can be ultimately charming too. Have people feel intimidated and frightened by them. So we'll talk about what's happening inside the world and the profile of a narcissistic individual. But we're also going to pay attention to what's happening inside of us as therapists, what gets activated in us, because it is one of the number one reasons why we cannot be effective in working with them is because we get triggered. And I'll try to provide some examples of that in a moment. I'm going to, for the sake of time, because it's so limited, I'm going to skip through some slides where I feel like it just may not be necessary for our purposes today. But you have the handout, or I assume you're going to have the handout of the slides. So you'll be able to take a look and perhaps do some reading on your own. And maybe we'll meet again at another time. So our tendency when we get triggered, I work mostly with narcissistic men, and I work mostly with narcissistic men who are on the severe end of the spectrum. So I work with pretty highly aggressive, more malignant types of narcissistic men. I've also worked with those who are more moderate and those that are more mild. And we like to think about narcissism happening along a spectrum, like most personalities, that it's not one size fits all, but that there are variations in terms of intensity and in terms of the numbers of traits that you might see. When we get triggered by the narcissist, our tendency, if we're activated emotionally, is some of us want to punish them. Like, how dare you insult me? How dare you be critical of me? Some of us just want to allow them to go on, talk and entertain us and tell stories and make excuses. Some of us give in to their demands because it just feels more easy and peaceful than trying to confront them and address the problem. We may avoid, we may fight back. None of this is helpful, by the way, because it's not doing essentially what we need to do when they're in that particular mode. We're not setting limits. We're not exploring, investigating, inspecting what's really happening behind the scenes for the narcissist. That is our critical work as schema therapists. We're looking to understand the need that has not been met, the need that wasn't met that led to this construction of a mode that perhaps had a lot of value when they were young in helping them to perform and achieve, but now in their adult lives, dealing with people interpersonally in relationship is problematic. And that's typically why they come to therapy, because their ability to empathize, to connect, to be intimately open, to be emotionally present, to be understanding and remorseful, to be able to be patient and reciprocal, the give and take in relationships. This is the place where the narcissist struggles, and we'll see why. So we need a highly effective approach for dealing with these difficult issues of narcissism in the treatment room. And we have one in schema therapy. And there aren't many models that can promise the kind of effectiveness if you have the right elements. I'll put that in very bold language. As with all challenging personality types, we must have certain very essential elements in place. And I'll describe that to you in a moment. But this model is one that's so effective, as Patricia mentioned, because we are integrated. We're not eclectic. In other words, it's not just a garbage can full of different ideas. It's a very thoughtful, deliberate selection of models of therapy that blend with our conceptual framework to help us to create the type of change that is not just interesting and intellectual, but it's enduring, it's lasting, because it goes into the emotional zone. And that's what schema therapy does. It reaches beyond the here and now, and not only into childhood experiences, which of course are important for informing us of the patient's narrative, of their story, right? But it also helps us to appreciate all of the emotions that are circulating within that experience that have taken them from childhood to the here and now. So the typical schemas, and just really quickly for some of you who may not understand the language of schemas yet, schemas are traits. They are beliefs that are held in the core. We all have them. We all have more than one or two, in fact. No one has a perfect life or a perfect childhood. We all have biological genetic coding that contributes to our personalities as well. So schemas are the traits, the core emotional beliefs that carry physical sensation, intense emotion, impulses to behave in certain ways when they get triggered. And so this is the profile. What you see on the screen in the purplish color are the schemas that we typically see in a profile of narcissism. I'm going to go through them a little quicker than I usually would, again, for the sake of time. You can read more about this if you find this interesting to you. I hope you will. So we usually see mistrust and abuse. And not because the narcissist is typically an abused child like you probably heard Joan Farrell talk about with BPD, but because they have felt used. And so often in the early origins of narcissism, you have a child who felt that they were like a surrogate, like a partner to their parents, as opposed to being a child of their parents, that they were chosen for specific expectations and demands. And so they don't trust easily. They're usually very suspicious of people's motives. They feel like everyone's just trying to take advantage of them or use them. And in the treatment room, this can be very problematic because they'll be accusing you of just, you just want my money. I pay you. And they're suspicious about even lovely gestures like, I care about you. I care about your well-being. I want to help you. I want you to have a healthier and more satisfying relationship. They're suspicious about that because they're not accustomed to unconditional acceptance. They're not accustomed to that level of intimacy. And so in the therapy relationship, this can be very provocative at activating the schema. It's incredibly important as therapists of schema therapy that we be real people in therapy, that we act as real humans, and that we're not using so much of the jargon, the very intellectual language of clinicians. It's your best way of beginning to formulate the bond with the narcissist is to be real. And so it's not unusual for someone to watch me demonstrate or to see me in a session with a narcissist saying things like, wow, that was pretty harsh, Joe. Why are you talking to me like that? Or, well, gee, yeah, I can understand that it must be hard for you to believe that I could actually care about you and your marriage and the welfare of your children. I know you're not used to that, but there's probably better ways that you could tell that to me other than just being critical of me. I mean, I'm a therapist, so I understand that given your makeup, this might be something that comes easy to you. It just sort of comes right out of your mouth. But for other people out there in the universe who aren't trained in psychology, they would feel offended. They might feel hurt by that, right? So we're very real. We use ourselves. We use the experience that's happening in our own little laboratory to make clear these activations, to understand the origins. Okay, I'll get to origins a little bit more, but let's go on through the list. Emotional deprivation is another typical schema in narcissism, meaning that it's this core feeling deep in the soul that says, I don't believe that there will be people in my life that I can count on for emotional support, for empathy, for understanding, for caring, for affection. And the narcissist, when you present that to them, will usually say, I don't need it. I don't need those things, because they're great deniers of their own emotional needs. They've been trained to not have those needs. They've been taught that that's a sign of weakness. It may come out of a cultural learning. It may come out of just a family that is expecting high performance and doesn't have time for unconditional love. So we look at the narcissist as one who has pretty much been starved of unconditional love, and also starved of good limit setting. And I'll talk about that in a second. They have, believe it or not, at the core, a high sense of defectiveness and shame. This is a schema that would have them feeling that they are inadequate, they're not lovable, they're not good enough, that they're not really valuable. And that's weird, right? Because narcissists come across as being larger than life, being the best of the best, being the top performers, being the strong and the mighty, being the ones in control, being the ones who will put you down, being the ones who have to be right about everything, and they know it all. So it's weird, right? To think they really feel that insecure underneath. Yeah. And that explains why they have this mode, this big mode, as we call it, which is this state of mind, this way of being, this way of coping in the universe for hiding and suppressing and tucking in that deep shame and insecurity that they carry around. They have this social isolation schema. They don't feel like everybody else. First of all, they feel that they're uniquely special and very different and better than other people. Some of them they may have come by that idea because they were raised by parents who just spoiled them and told them they were better than everyone else, maybe a very high status family. But many of the ones we treat, which are more fragile types, they'll come by that because when they were young, they didn't know how to fit in. They may have been the nerdy ones, the ones who were forced to study, who had to do well academically, who had to perform athletically. And again, I'm not just talking about boys. This is also girls. Women can be narcissists just like men. I've treated some female narcissists. Later on, perhaps when we take questions, I can talk a little bit about the differences between the two. But I'm using the male pronoun because A, it is a bit more common, generally speaking, and B, it's the population I work with most of the time. So for many of my patients, social isolation means they were so busy performing and trying to be the best of the best because that was the demand that was placed upon them. They didn't fit in. They were annoying to their classmates. They may have had friends, but not deep, intimate connections. They may have been bullied and teased. And I've had many narcissistic men in my practice who were the victims of bullying when they were young. And they had nowhere to go to talk about that because it's a sign of weakness if you can't stand up and fight for yourself. So this social isolation schema is the idea that I don't fit in, right? I don't fit in. Approval seeking is the schema where, and this is very, again, classic in narcissism, we find our patients to be always looking for recognition, for admiration, for the applause of the audience, for feeling that they are the best of the best. And by winning the approval of someone who they decide is important enough, it helps to give value. It helps them to feel that they are less defective and insecure. Of course, it's all by way of performance, so it doesn't really resolve the problem at the end of the day. The failure schema is all about their competition, right? Failure is that other people in my immediate zone, my immediate peer group might be better than me, might do better than me, might win the competition. So it's always about the fear that I might fail, I may take second place or third place, God forbid. And so it's all about, working hard to always be number one. And that doesn't mean that they're all super successful people. Many of them are because of these origins and because they were chosen as the bright one in the family who could succeed. But you can find narcissists in every socioeconomic status. They're all out there, not just in the upper, the upper tier of successful people.